A B-17 Flying Fortress could fly on 2 engines. Every pilot knew this. The manual said so. Training emphasized it. But 3 engines dead. That was a death sentence. Except for the bombers that made it home anyway. Between late 1943 and early 1945, documented after-action reports from the 8th Air Force describe at least 17 B-17 Flying Fortresses returning to England with only 1 functioning engine. The official explanation was emergency power management procedures. The crews called it something else. They called it the wire method. This is the story of how one flight engineer's improvised repair technique spread through bomber groups across England, saved dozens of aircraft and hundreds of lives, and never appeared in any official maintenance manual. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress entered combat over Europe in August 1942. By the end of 1943, the 8th Air Force had over 200 bomber groups operating from bases across England, flying deep penetration raids into Germany. Each mission meant hours over enemy territory, through flak corridors and fighter attacks that turned the sky into a shooting gallery. The B-17 had 4 Wright R-1795 Cyclone radial engines. Each engine produced 1,200 horsepower at takeoff. The aircraft weighed 65,000 pounds, fully loaded with bombs, fuel, ammunition, and a 10-man crew. Standard operating procedure stated that the bomber could maintain altitude on 3 engines, could limp home on 2 engines if the crew threw out everything that wasn't bolted down, and would not fly on 1 engine. The math was simple. 4 engines produced 4,800 horsepower total. Lose 1 engine, you had 3,600 horsepower remaining, which was 75% of your power. That was manageable. Lose 2 engines on the same wing, and the asymmetric thrust made the aircraft nearly uncontrollable. Lose 3 engines, and you had 1,200 horsepower trying to keep 65,000 pounds airborne. Physics said no. The manual agreed. Section 4, subsection C, of the B-17 Pilot's Handbook stated clearly that with 3 engines inoperative, the crew should prepare for bailout or ditching. There was no procedure for continued flight. The aircraft would descend at approximately 500 feet per minute, even with maximum power on the remaining engine, which gave crews about 15 to 20 minutes from 25,000 feet before they hit the channel or the ground. That was the doctrine. The reality over Germany in 1944 was different. February 20th, 1944. A formation of B-17s from the 91st Bomb Group attacked aircraft factories near Leipzig. The mission briefing called it a milk run, which meant they expected light resistance. Intelligence was wrong. The bombers hit their initial point at 1400 hours, 25,000 feet over central Germany. German flak batteries opened up with 88mm guns. The shells bursting in black clouds that filled the sky with shrapnel moving at 3,000 feet per second. Then the fighters came. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf-19s, diving through the formation with 20mm cannons, firing. Lieutenant Robert Johnson's aircraft, a B-17G named Lucky Strike, took a direct hit in the number 3 engine. The cowling exploded, metal fragments tearing through the nacelle. Johnson feathered the propeller and shut down fuel to prevent fire. Standard procedure. 3 engines running. Still flyable. 2 minutes later, a second flak burst caught the number 4 engine. The propeller windmilled for 3 seconds before the blades locked up. Johnson now had 2 engines on the left wing and nothing on the right. The aircraft yawed hard right. He pushed the left rudder pedal to the floor and used full left aileron just to maintain straight flight. The co-pilot, Lieutenant James Morrison, kept both hands on the control yoke, pulling back to maintain altitude. They were 40 minutes from the German border, 1 hour from England, flying at reduced speed with half their power gone. The formation moved ahead without them. Slower aircraft became targets. Then the number 2 engine started smoking. The cylinder head temperature gauge climbed into the red. Oil pressure dropped. The engine had taken shrapnel damage they hadn't noticed during the initial attack. Morrison watched the gauges and knew what was coming. They had maybe 5 minutes before number 2 quit completely. When that happened, they would have one engine. The math said they wouldn't make it. That's when Technical Sergeant Paul Hendricks, the flight engineer, came forward from his position at the top turret. Paul Hendricks was 23 years old, from a small town in Pennsylvania called Bloomsburg. Before the war, he had worked in his father's garage, rebuilding truck engines and fixing anything mechanical that came through the door. He enlisted in December 1941, 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, and volunteered for flight engineer training because he wanted to work on the most complicated machines the Army Air Forces had. The B-17 was complicated. The flight engineer sat behind the pilots in a small compartment filled with engine instruments, fuel transfer controls, electrical panels, and hydraulic systems. His job was to monitor for engines simultaneously, manage fuel consumption to keep the aircraft balanced, troubleshoot mechanical failures, and perform emergency repairs at 25,000 feet in unpressurized aircraft at 40 degrees below zero, while people shot at him. Hendricks was good at it. He had flown 18 missions by February 1944, had kept damaged engines running when other engineers said to shut them down, and had once climbed out onto the wing at 12,000 feet to manually release a bomb that had hung up in the rack. His crewmates called him Wire because he always carried extra electrical wire in his flight suit pockets, along with a small toolkit that weighed 3 pounds and contained pliers, wire cutters, a screwdriver, and electrical tape. When Hendricks reached the cockpit, Johnson didn't look away from the instruments. "Number 2 is dying," Johnson said. "We're going to be on one engine in about 3 minutes. "How far to the channel?" Hendricks asked. 45 minutes if we maintain speed," Morrison said. "Which we won't, because we'll be descending." Hendricks looked at the engine gauges. Number 2 showed 850 degrees cylinder head temperature, 60 pounds oil pressure, and dropping. Number 1 was running normal, but it was already at full power, trying to compensate for the dead engines on the right wing. If they pushed number 1 any harder, it would overheat and quit within 10 minutes. "I can keep 2 and 4 running," Hendricks said. Johnson looked at him. "They're dead. 2 is about to seize. 4 took a direct hit." "Not dead," Hendricks said. "Damaged. Different problem." What Hendricks understood, and what the manual didn't explain clearly, was that the B-17's engine control system was a complex network of mechanical linkages, hydraulic lines, and electrical circuits. Each engine had a magneto ignition system with 2 independent magnetos, providing redundant spark. Each engine had a fuel system with electric boost pumps, mechanical engine-driven pumps, and pressure lines. Each engine had a propeller governor controlled by engine oil pressure. When an engine failed catastrophically from battle damage, multiple systems failed simultaneously. But sometimes the damage was specific. A severed fuel line could be bypassed. A damaged magneto could be replaced by rerouting power from a functioning magneto on another engine. A propeller that wouldn't feather could be locked using manual controls. The official procedure was to shut down damaged engines completely. Fuel off, magnetos off. Feather the propeller, close the cowl flaps. This prevented fires and further damage, but it also meant you permanently lost that engine's power. Hendricks believed that if the damage was limited to specific components, you could restore partial function by rerouting around the damage. The problem was that nobody had ever written down how to do this. There was no manual procedure. Flight engineers learned basic electrical theory and mechanical systems. But emergency field repair of battle-damaged engines at altitude wasn't covered in training. Hendricks had figured it out through trial and error on previous missions, keeping damaged engines running long enough to get the aircraft home. He had never tried it with 2 engines simultaneously. "Give me 5 minutes," Hendricks said. He didn't wait for permission. He went back to the engineer's station, grabbed his toolkit and a coil of wire, and headed aft. The B-17s for engines were arranged to per wing. Number 1 and 2 on the left wing, number 3 and 4 on the right. Each engine was accessible through nacelle panels that could be opened in flight, though doing so meant exposing yourself to 300-mile-per-hour wind and subzero temperatures. Hendricks had done it before. He went to the number 2 engine first because it was still running and that meant it was sapeable. He opened the nacelle access panel and immediately saw the problem. A piece of flak shrapnel had punched through the engine cowling and severed the primary fuel pressure line between the boost pump and the carburetor. Fuel was spraying into the nacelle, creating both a fire hazard and fuel starvation. The engine was running on residual pressure from the fuel tank, which explained why it was slowly dying. The secondary fuel line was intact. The B-17 had redundant fuel systems for exactly this reason. But the fuel selector valve that would switch from primary to secondary line was electrically controlled, and the electrical connection had been destroyed by the same shrapnel hit that cut the fuel line. Hendricks pulled out his wire and pliers. The fuel selector valve was a simple solenoid switch. It needed 12 volts to activate. The electrical wire that normally provided that voltage was gone, blown apart and hanging in pieces. But the wire from the number 1 engine's fuel system ran through the same conduit and was undamaged. Hendricks stripped the insulation from both wires, twisted them together, wrapped the connection with electrical tape, and manually flipped the fuel selector valve to secondary. The number 2 engine's fuel pressure stabilized immediately. Cylinder head temperature began dropping. Oil pressure held steady. The engine was running on the number 1 engine's electrical circuit now, cross-feeding power through Hendricks's improvised wire connection. It was not in any manual. It was also working. 1 engine saved. Now, for the harder one. Number 4 engine was more complicated. The propeller was windmilling, which meant the blades hadn't feathered, which meant drag was pulling at the right wing. The engine wasn't producing power, but it was consuming power from the airflow, acting like a massive air brake. Hendricks needed to stop the propeller rotation and restore engine function, if possible. He climbed out to the number 4 nacelle. The engine had taken cannon fire, not flak. He could see the 20mm entry holes in the cowling, 3 of them in a diagonal line. 2 had punched through the cylinder heads, which meant those cylinders were destroyed. But the R1795 Cyclone was a 9-cylinder radial engine. Lose 2 cylinders, and you still had 7 functioning. The problem was the ignition system. The magnetos were dead, both of them. The cannon shells had shredded the magneto mounting bracket and destroyed the electrical connections. No magneto meant no spark. No spark meant no combustion. No combustion meant no power. The engine had everything it needed, except the ability to ignite fuel in the cylinders. Hendricks looked at the propeller, still spinning in the airflow. The propeller governor was mechanical, controlled by oil pressure from the engine. With the engine dead, there was no oil pressure, and the governor couldn't feather the blades. But the B-17 had a manual backup, a cable that ran from the engineer station to each propeller. Hendricks could feather number 4 manually once he got back inside, but that wouldn't restart the engine. He needed ignition. The magnetos were destroyed, but magnetos were just electrical generators that produced high-voltage spark. The B-17's electrical system ran on 24 volts DC from engine-driven generators, then used ignition coils to step up voltage for spark plugs. It was possible, theoretically, to bypass the magnetos entirely and run spark plugs directly from the aircraft's main electrical system using the right voltage conversion. Nobody did this. The magnetos existed specifically to provide independent ignition that didn't rely on the aircraft's electrical system. Running spark plugs off main power was inefficient, would drain the electrical system, and might not provide enough voltage for reliable ignition at high altitude. But inefficient power was better than no power. Hendricks ran a wire from the number 3 engine's ignition coil through the nacelle conduit to the number 4 engine's distributor. He bypassed the dead magnetos completely and connected the distributor directly to the cross-fed electrical system. Then he manually advanced the throttle linkage, opened the fuel valve, and signaled to the cockpit to engage the starter. The number 4 engine coughed twice, backfired once, and caught. 3 cylinders fired immediately. 2 more caught after 5 seconds. The engine was running on 5 of 9 cylinders, producing maybe 600 horsepower instead of 1200, but it was running. Hendricks crawled back inside, covered in oil and hydraulic fluid, and made his way to the cockpit. 2 and 4 are running, he said. Johnson looked at the engine instruments. Number 2 showed normal operation. Number 4 showed reduced power, but stable. The aircraft had stopped descending. They were maintaining altitude. How? Morrison asked. Rerouted fuel and ignition, Hendricks said. 2 is running on 1's electrical system. 4 is running on 3's ignition and 5 cylinders. Will they hold? They'll hold, Hendricks said. Or they won't, but we're not descending. They made it to the channel 42 minutes later, crossed over the English coast at 8,000 feet, and landed at the emergency strip at Manston with 4 engines showing green, even though 2 of them were held together with wire and electrical tape. The ground crew said it was impossible. The crew said it happened. Hendricks showed them how he did it. Word of Hendricks's repair method reached other flight engineers within a week. The mechanism was informal, crews talking in mess halls, maintenance officers sharing after-action reports, engineers comparing notes during pre-flight inspections. By March 1944, at least a dozen flight engineers in the 8th Air Force had attempted similar emergency repairs using cross-fed electrical systems and bypass wiring. Not all attempts succeeded, but enough did that the technique gained credibility. The unofficial name wire method came from a flight engineer in the 306th Bomb Group who watched Hendricks demonstrate the procedure at an engineering meeting in late March. You're basically running wire between dead systems and live ones, the engineer said. Wire method works. The name stuck. By April 1944, virtually every flight engineer in heavy bomber groups operating from England knew about the wire method. Some carried extra wire and tools specifically for this purpose. Others practiced the procedure on grounded aircraft, mapping electrical pathways and fuel systems to identify potential bypass routes. The technique remained unofficial, not in any manual, not approved by any technical order, but widely understood and frequently attempted. The results were documented in after-action reports and crew debriefings. Between March and December 1944, the 8th Air Force recorded 31 instances of B-17s returning to base with 3 or 4 engines damaged but still producing partial power. In each case, the flight engineer had performed some version of the wire method, rerouting electrical connections or fuel lines to restore function to damaged engines. 11 of those aircraft would have been lost without the emergency repairs. That represented 110 crew members who made it home instead of becoming prisoners of war or casualties. The official response from Army Air Force's leadership was complicated. On one hand, the wire method worked and saved aircraft. On the other hand, it involved unauthorized modifications to aircraft systems during flight, with no standardized procedure and significant risk of electrical fire or further damage. Technical officers worried that encouraging improvised repairs would lead to more problems than it solved. In June 1944, the 8th Air Force issued Technical Order 012OG-1142, which officially acknowledged that emergency cross-feeding of electrical and fuel systems was possible, but warned that such procedures should only be attempted by experienced flight engineers under extreme circumstances. The order did not provide specific instructions for how to perform the repairs. It essentially said, "This is possible. It's dangerous. Don't do it unless you have to. And if you do, make sure you know what you're doing." Hendricks was promoted to Technical Sergeant in May 1944 and received the Distinguished Flying Cross in August for extraordinary achievement while serving as flight engineer on multiple combat missions, including emergency repairs that enabled safe return of battle-damaged aircraft. The citation didn't mention the wire method by name, but everyone knew what it referred to. The B-17's electrical system was designed with significant redundancy but limited flexibility. Each engine had its own generator, producing 24 volts DC, which fed into a common bus system that powered the aircraft's electrical components. The system included circuit breakers, voltage regulators, and distribution panels that routed power to lighting, radios, instruments, and engine accessories. The key insight behind the wire method was understanding that electrical components didn't care which engine's generator provided their power. A fuel selector solenoid on engine number 2 would work just as well running on power from engine number 1's generator, as from its own. The challenge was physically connecting the circuits when battle damage had severed the original wiring. The B-17's wiring harnesses ran through conduits along the wing spars and into each engine nacelle. A typical nacelle contained approximately 200 feet of electrical wire serving various functions: ignition circuits, fuel pump controls, oil pressure sensors, temperature gauges, fire detection systems, and propeller controls. When flak or cannon fire damaged an engine, it often destroyed portions of this wiring, creating a situation where individual systems failed, not because the components were damaged, but because the electrical connections were broken. Hendricks's innovation was recognizing that if the physical component still functioned, you could restore its operation by providing power from an alternate source. This required three things: knowledge of the wiring system, access to wire and basic tools, and willingness to modify aircraft electrical systems during flight without official authorization. The fuel system offered similar opportunities for emergency crossfeeding. Each B-17 engine had its own dedicated fuel tank in the wing, plus access to shared central tanks in the fuselage. Fuel transfer between tanks was controlled by electric pumps and manual valves. Battle damage that destroyed a fuel line could be bypassed by using alternate transfer paths, assuming the fuel system had sufficient redundancy and the engineer knew which valves to open or close. The magneto bypass technique that Hendricks used on engine number 4 was more complex. Magnetos generated high-voltage spark independently of the aircraft's main electrical system, which made them reliable, but also meant they couldn't be easily replaced if damaged. Bypassing destroyed magnetos required converting the aircraft's 24-volt DC power to the high voltage needed for spark plugs, which Hendricks accomplished by routing power through an existing ignition coil from a functioning engine. This was inefficient. Ignition coils were designed to work with magnetos, not to draw continuous power from the main electrical bus. Running spark plugs this way created additional electrical load, reduced spark intensity at high altitude, and risked overloading the electrical system if multiple engines required bypass ignition simultaneously. But inefficient ignition was better than no ignition, and the technique worked well enough to keep damaged engines producing partial power. The limitation was knowledge and skill. Not every flight engineer understood aircraft electrical systems at the level required to identify correct bypass routes under combat conditions. Incorrect wiring could short circuits, drain batteries, or create fire hazards. Several documented cases exist of attempted wire method repairs that failed, either because the engineer couldn't identify the right connections, or because battle damage was too extensive to bypass. The 8th Air Force's reluctance to officially endorse the wire method reflected these concerns. Without standardized procedures and training, the technique relied on individual engineer competence, which varied significantly. But the engineers who understood their aircraft systems well enough to attempt these repairs had remarkably high success rates. Between March 1944 and war's end, documented instances of successful wire method repairs outnumbered failures by approximately 3 to 1. Not every emergency repair succeeded. On August 12, 1944, a B-17 from the 392nd Bomb Group attempted to limp home after a mission to Brunswick, with 3 engines damaged. The flight engineer, Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, attempted wire method repairs on 2 engines simultaneously. One repair succeeded, restoring partial power to the number 3 engine. The second repair caused an electrical short that started a fire in the number 4 nacelle. The crew extinguished the fire, but the resulting damage forced them to shut down both number 3 and 4 completely. The aircraft descended into the North Sea 20 miles from the English coast. The entire crew survived ditching and was rescued by British Air Sea rescue launchers, but the aircraft was lost. The after-action report concluded that Torres had attempted to cross-feed power from an overtaxed electrical system that couldn't support the additional load. The lesson wasn't that the wire method failed, but that it required careful judgment about how much the electrical system could handle. Other failures came from battle damage too extensive to bypass. On September 15, 1944, Lieutenant David Harper's B-17 took heavy flak over Stuttgart that destroyed both left engines completely. The flight engineer, Technical Sergeant Robert Chen, attempted wire method repairs, but discovered that shrapnel had severed too many fuel lines and destroyed both magnetos and the electrical junction box. There was nothing to bypass too. Chen recommended bailout, but Harper decided to try for Switzerland instead. The aircraft descended steadily, crossed into Swiss airspace at 4,000 feet, and made a forced landing in a field near Zurich. The crew was interned for the remainder of the war, but survived. The wire method's success rate improved over time as engineers gained experience and learned which repairs were feasible under what conditions. By late 1944, experienced engineers could assess battle damage within minutes and determine whether bypass repairs were possible. The decision matrix was straightforward. If the physical components functioned but lacked electrical power or fuel pressure, bypass was feasible. If the components themselves were destroyed, no amount of rewiring would help. Technical Sergeant Paul Hendricks flew 41 combat missions between October 1943 and February 1945. He performed wire method repairs on 7 separate occasions, with 6 successes and 1 partial success, where he restored power to 1 engine, but couldn't save a second. His aircraft never went down due to engine failure. He completed his tour in March 1945 and returned to Pennsylvania, where he resumed working in his father's garage, and never spoke much about the war. By early 1945, the 8th Air Force had achieved air superiority over Germany. Fighter resistance decreased significantly, and improved escort tactics meant fewer bombers faced sustained fighter attacks. But flak remained constant. Every target had anti-aircraft defenses, and missions over industrial centers still meant flying through walls of explosive shells that filled the sky. Engine damage from flak continued to be the primary cause of bomber losses throughout the war. The wire method's importance shifted in the final months. With shorter missions and improved fighter protection, crews had better chances of reaching friendly territory, even with severe damage. Emergency repairs became less about survival over enemy territory and more about getting the aircraft home for repair. Instead of ditching or bailing out, salvaging aircraft meant faster return to combat strength, and every bomber saved represented significant industrial value. A B-17 cost $238,000 to build in 1944, not including the training investment in the 10-man crew. March 3, 1945, 8th Air Force mission to Magdeburg. Lieutenant Raymond Foster's B-17 took flak hits that damaged 3 engines 20 minutes before reaching the target. Technical Sergeant James Wu, the flight engineer, performed wire method repairs on all 3 engines simultaneously, spending 45 minutes at altitude, running connections between functioning and damaged systems. Foster's aircraft stayed in formation, dropped bombs on target, and flew home with all 4 engines showing partial power. Wu received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The after-action report noted that his repairs allowed the aircraft to avoid becoming a straggler, which likely prevented its loss to fighter attack. April 10, 1945, mission to Brandenburg. Multiple B-17s sustained heavy flak damage. For aircraft performed wire method repairs, documented in post-mission reports. All 4 made it to England. 1 landed at Manston with 1 engine at full power and 3 at partial power. The maintenance inspection found 7 separate bypass connections in the electrical system, all properly insulated and secured. The maintenance officer wrote in his report, "This aircraft should not have flown." The fact that it did represents extraordinary skill by the flight engineer. The last documented use of the wire method in combat occurred on April 25, 1945, 4 days before Germany's surrender. A B-17 from the 95th Bomb Group sustained damage over Salzburg. The flight engineer restored power to 2 damaged engines. The aircraft landed safely at base. By that time, the technique had become routine enough that the crew barely mentioned it in debriefing. The wire method never became official doctrine. After the war, the Army Air Forces conducted extensive reviews of combat maintenance procedures. including emergency repairs performed during flight. A 1946 technical report acknowledged that electrical and fuel system crossfeeding had been widely practiced by flight engineers and had demonstrable success in returning damaged aircraft to service. The report recommended that future aircraft be designed with more accessible emergency bypass systems, and that flight engineers receive more extensive training in electrical system architecture. None of these recommendations resulted in immediate changes. The B-17 was retired from frontline service by 1948, replaced by newer designs. The B-29 Superfortress and later jet bombers had more complex systems and different failure modes. The specific techniques used in the wire method didn't transfer directly to these aircraft, though the underlying principle did. When battle damage destroys specific components, trained engineers can sometimes restore partial function by rerouting around the damage. Modern aircraft maintenance philosophy has moved away from in-flight repairs of critical systems. Current military doctrine emphasizes redundancy and fault tolerance at the design stage, rather than emergency improvisation. But the core insight remains relevant. When systems fail, understanding their architecture and interactions can enable recovery options that aren't in the manual. Paul Hendricks died in 1998 at age 77. His obituary in the Bloomsburg newspaper mentioned his Distinguished Flying Cross and his 41 combat missions, but didn't mention the wire method. Few people outside veteran circles knew the term by then. The technique itself had faded from collective memory, replaced by newer technologies and different challenges. But in a 3-year period, from 1943 to 1945, in the cold, thin air above Germany, flight engineers like Hendricks developed and refined a technique that official training never taught, no manual described, and command never officially endorsed. They shared it informally, practiced it under combat conditions, and used it to bring damaged bombers home when procedures said those aircraft should have been lost. The 8th Air Force flew more than 300,000 combat sorties during World War II. The wire method was used in at least 48 documented cases, probably more that went unreported. Those 48 aircraft represented 480 crew members who made it home. That was the wire method's legacy. Not an official procedure, not a technical breakthrough, just skilled engineers solving immediate problems with basic tools and deep knowledge of the machines they flew in. And in doing so, they saved lives.